All right, at this time, I'm going to turn things over to Wayne from the CMMC AB.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Kudos to Tim and BDO for hosting this. I had actually forgotten about committing to this until he asked me about a week ago. I don't do a lot of webinars. I have a personal philosophy. I don't do webinars unless somebody from the Discord asks me, so here I am. I want to give a couple disclaimers. Although I am here representing the CMMC AB as a board director, I'm going to speak to the DFARS interim final rule, but no opinions that I put forward are anything other than mine. They're not the CMMC AB, my employer, or the DoD. I've been mobile today, so I didn't get a lot of what's gone on already, but I did see Nick's presentation just now, and he's alluded to some of the interim final rule a little bit. I'm going to dive in a little bit more. And originally, I was just going to have one slide talking about some of the commonly asked questions I see out there in various social medias that need answered, but I figured I should get some context before we got there, just so everybody understands it. I got 20 minutes. I'm not going to belabor it because I think probably better getting into the Q&A session where we can have some interaction. So with that said, next slide, please. So as Nick alluded to earlier, the Cybersecurity Interim Final Rule was released on September 29th. We've been expecting this for CMMC for what seems to be an eternity, and I personally heard soon, next week, for quite some time. All of us expected it to be related to CMMC. Surprise, surprise to us, there was a curveball thrown, and that is the 7019 and 7020 clauses in addition to CMMC. The comment period is open till November 30th, and I highly encourage everybody to make comments about the rule, feedback to the DoD. I posted on LinkedIn actually and commented to those who spend all kinds of time commenting on social media about things they don't like about CMMC to put that much energy into providing comments back to the DoD who can actually do something about it. And I hope folks take advantage of that. But we just got our company input submitted minutes ago, so we try to get ahead of the curve and get it in. But please be sure to comment on it and read it closely. Two of the implementations that we weren't expecting, as I alluded to before, was 7019 and 7020. And that 7019 requires you to have a current assessment based on the DoD assessment methodology. In February of last year, the OSD directed the DCMA to create this assessment methodology, which the first version I saw was in May of last year, to complete these assessments. So although it says have a current assessment less than 3 years old, you need to be careful now. I've seen some people asking about doing assessments based on some of the methodology, but if you were to post one of these self-assessments in SPURS and say you did it in, let's say, January of 2019, you're going to get called out because that assessment methodology did not exist. There's 3 levels of assessments based on, this is mostly based on the competence in the assessment. The basic is called just that because it's done by the company and it's a self-assessment. The medium is performed by DCMA and it is accomplished now virtually, of course, but it's mostly a document review and look at the security plan and so on, whereas in the high, they actually ask you to demonstrate things, shoulder surfing, like you may want to look at your instance of your incident response process. They may want to look at Splunk and see how you monitor things, something like that. 2020 has a flow down requirement. It has to flow down to your suppliers. You have to verify your supplier's assessment SPRF. That's a bit of a thing you might want to comment about. How are you supposed to accomplish that? Do you have to take their word for it? Do you want a screen capture of their score? You know, what's the process to actually verify that, and what's the expected level of effort from the prime to the sub to be compliant with that? And then the DoD can decide if they want to perform a medium or high assessment post-award. Now, something on the DCMA assessments, I keep seeing references to requesting DCMA perform an assessment. Generally, I don't think that's going to happen. DCMA carefully plans out their assessment schedule ahead of time based on their resources, and they're not going to have the resources to just assess any given person who might want it. And then finally, 7021 is what we were all waiting for, CMMC. It's going to be at all contracts requiring CMMC. There's a flow down. Contractors have to meet a specified level 1 through 5 based on the sensitivity of the data. And over there on the lower right there's a phased rollout. The initial rollout is going to be 15 contracts. That's the pilot program, and then so on. One thing we do appreciate is OSD has put out plenty of guidance to say no CMMC clause will go in any contract unless it's approved by OSD. So that gives me a lot of confidence that there's not going to be random contracting officers throw it into a contract. Now, that could happen, but I encourage folks to push back to the degree you're comfortable and see if it's approved by OSD. And that may be an interesting conversation between your program within the company and the contracting officer. Generally, they don't want to stir up things, but you may want to do it if you don't feel like it should be in your contract. Next slide, please. A little bit of detail behind 7019 specifically. I explained the levels of the assessments, 3 years old. They could be conducted at the corporate level or at the entity level. That pretty much has to do with the fact that if you want to do it at the company level and everything flows down to the programs, that's one opportunity. If you have program unique environments, you may have to perform the assessment on that specific unique environment depending on how things flow down from the corporate level. This is a verification that the DoD is kicking in to kind of get somewhere between 70-12 self-attestation and full implementation of CMMC. So it ups the game a little bit more than 70-12, but not quite to a third-party assessment. The scores must be loaded into SPURS. I got a slide later to talk more about SPURS. There's 6 fields here that talks about in the rule: SSP name, cage code, description, date of assessment score, and date to achieve 110. However, if you read the rule closely, there's a distinct difference between what you can submit if you're in SPURS and what you submit if you're in email, sending in an email. There's no field in SPURS if you're entering it directly to submit an SSP name or any kind of description. It's much less information. So also commenting about that, because if you submit that information via an email, how's that going to go in SPURS because there's no fields to hold it. Scores may well determine an award. Initially, when I first heard about this, I heard things along the lines of, well, they don't really care what score you have, you just need to get a score in. But the more I read the rule and the more I heard that the score very well could be determined too low and the contract not awarded. Now, you may want to comment on that also and ask about what's the methodology going to be behind how that's determined. And we all know that a 105 is not equal between 2 different companies, because it's possible to have a 105 score and not implement multi-factor and FIPS validated encryption. Hopefully my math's right there, but and another company that does have both of those implemented, those scores are not equal, because multi-factor, as we know, is a significant defense against some of the attacks we deal with from the APP. There are exceptions for acquisitions, procurement solely for COTS or below micro purchase thresholds. Next slide, please. 7020 describes the assessment methodology. There's a screen capture, a part of that page over on the right. It has to be flowed down. There's procedures for posting the scores in the rule regarding that. Again, that 3-year requirement. And basically, this methodology is a scoring of not yet implemented controls. Now, what the guidance kind of I'm giving to our folks are, since you should know what your SSP looks like and what your compliance is, basically you could zip through this pretty quick, assign a score, a full score for anything that doesn't have a POAM, and then if it has a POAM, do the math accordingly. As you can see on the lower right there, subtracting for multi-factor could be a 3-point subtraction or a 5-point subtraction, depending on what's not implemented and what is. Next slide. 7021 is CMMC for the most part. There was no surprises here, at least to me, but then again, I've had a little more access than the average person. But one thing that is a bit surprising is they talk about using SPRS to enter the scores for CMMC. I'm not sure how that's going to pan out. I'd heard that there is going to be a CMMC EMAS to hold those scores. Maybe SPRS is a bridge, but that's not something I had expected to see. So that's probably about the only surprise out of the CMMC. I think that's it for this slide. Next slide. So SPRS, the Supplier Performance Risk System. This is an existing tool that the DoD contracting community and supply chain uses to perform risk assessment on contractors as a supplier. We're kind of coming late to the game with something specific to cyber, but this has existed for some time, and I'll have to tell you, I've learned more about SPRS and cage codes in the last month since this rule was released than I had ever hoped to have to know. But basically, you enter SPRS in the cyber vendor role, and that gives you visibility to accomplish entering assessment scores. Your view is based on the highest level organization cage code, which is kind of the top of your hierarchy. The whole cage code hierarchy is fed into SPRS via a system called SAM, System for Award Management. So any changes or maintenance you need to do in your cage code structure has to take place there, and then it's fed over to SPRS. You can update basic assessment submissions that are already in SPRS. You can't touch the DIBCAC entered ones that are medium and high. Generally, if you have a DIBCAC assessment, the first step you are required to do for that is to complete a basic self-assessment and send it to them. And when you first go in there, if you've done that, you will see they've entered your basic self-assessment you completed. And that's first step of the DIBCAC assessment, that's in there. One of the things that we're struggling, I don't know if struggling was the right word, we're considering, and every company should consider, is who is going to have the ownership and update responsibilities for basic assessments, because it even speaks to it in the rule to some degree. The score you enter in SPRS has significant liability with it. One, you would be held to it, and there could be False Claims Act consequences if it's not correct. Secondly, you could lose a contract, as I spoke to before, if the DoD determines it's too low. So you really need to put thought into who do you want taking responsibility for entering that score. For a big company like us, we're kind of working to have that at the lower levels where individuals most in tune with a program environment know what it is, and then at the enterprise level, we're going to try and maintain high-level visibility as kind of a QA function. Next slide, please. Okay, here's the meat of what I hope to do. Looks like this slide's truncated a bit. Yeah, it's truncated. It's not all showing, but I'll go through it anyway. First question, the one I'm answering the most because I see the disinformation the most. I see endless amounts of commentary that says you have to have all these scores done and submitted by November 30th. That is absolutely incorrect. The rule goes into effect November 30th, and the scores must be in to SPRS for a contract that requires it by the time contract award comes, because the process described is the contracting officer is to go to SPRS, take the cage code from any given new contract, for example, and check to ensure that this score is in SPRS before contract award. So technically, if you are a small company and you have 2 contracts with the DoD and they're very long-term stable contracts and you don't expect to get any type of new contract activity, a mod or an extension or something that would allow them to inject 7019, 7020 in it, you may never see it for years, and therefore you don't have to do it. It just depends. The DoD has said they don't anticipate retroactively adding this to contracts, so it's a matter of how much you trust that or not. Even though none of this is due until you get it in a contract and prior to contract award, and break it into a contract award, sorry, I just got texted and I'm distracted. You want to start doing the self-assessments now, because at its most basic level, these self-assessments help you prepare for CMMC, specifically level 3. How do I submit my organization's DoD self-assessment? As you could see, or as I mentioned earlier, you can go into SPERS. I could spend a whole session on SPERS and how to get into it, but I'll just say it's part of the PIEE, the Procurement Integrated Enterprise Environment. That's where you set up the account that gives you access to a lot of DoD systems, of which one is SPERS. If you go out and Google SPRS reference material, there's a page that has a quick reference guide for NIST SP 800-171 quick entry guide that might be helpful. I guess I just answered the next one there. You may want to work within your organization to determine who should have SPERS, who should be entering things, who should be viewing things. Talk internally to Access before. Typically, if you have an existing SPERS account somewhere in your company, there's going to be an approval process. Somebody should get an email and approve you for doing that. Can subcontractors get access to SPERS or only primes? Are primes supposed to submit on behalf of subcontractors? No. Everybody has to submit their own scores. Subcontractors can get access to SPERS to submit their own scores, but your view is not going to allow you to see subcontractor scores. You're only going to be able to see scores relative to cage codes associated with your company. Here's a fun one from the rule that I've commented back on. What method should be used to send an encrypted email to the email displayed? Problem here is, I pointed out, this email address is the general support email for SPERS. I've not been able to find any associated encryption certificate that you need in order to send encrypted email to this address. I've heard of some folks email the address and ask about it, then they get somebody, a human, to email back who gives them a certificate, but it doesn't seem very scalable. What I suggested in my comments back to the DoD was, one, they probably need to set up a separate email address just for submissions of scores rather than the general support email, and then associate a certificate with it so you can actually send encrypted emails. Next slide. If you manage to get a encrypted email sent with your score, what I'm hearing is about 30 days for it to be posted in SPERS. I think it says in the rule that within 30 days it will be posted. I encourage everybody to get a SPERS account and do it, because for the most part it's instantaneous. So if you run into a situation where you have a contract award and you don't have that score up there yet, if you have an account in SPERS, then you can get that loaded right away, and it's available very quickly to the contracting officer to verify. Heard some folks saying that you have to send an SSP and POAM along with the score information in that email. Absolutely not. I actually got this verified through OSD. I thought the answer was no, because do we realistically want the DoD getting thousands and thousands of SSPs and POAMs from the defense industrial base and basically create a golden corral buffet for our adversary to come to one place to get all the material they need to know how to attack various companies? And the answer is no. No, they do not want those in any way, shape, or form. If my organization doesn't have CUI on our systems, should we submit something? No, absolutely not. If you read the rule carefully, 7019 and 7020 in the self-assessment of your compliance with NIST 800-171 only applies to contracts that are otherwise subject to 7012 compliance. So if you're not subject to 7012 and have CUI, you don't have to do a self-assessment because you're not required to be compliant with 7012. Multiple cage codes or multiple contracts use the same information system. How are you going to explain this in the submission? This is a good question of which I have no answer for. We suggested to the DoD last year on a call when they were talking about tying this sort of thing to cage codes not to do it because there's no clean mapping of cage codes to information systems or networks or anything, because typically cage codes are location specific. And with larger companies, with large sites, you may have hundreds of systems associated with a single cage code. So when you enter it into SPRS, you may have hundreds of self-assessment scores with varying scores associated with a single cage code. So when a contracting officer goes into SPRS to validate the cage code that's in a given contract and they see 50 or 100 scores, how are they going to be able to make the distinction of which one applies to them and what they're trying to accomplish? Hard to say. If my assessment's 2 years old, can I still use it since it says less than 3? Now here's that little nuance I mentioned earlier about, although at this point in time it says less than 3 years old, realistically it's going to have to be less than 18 months. And that's because the assessment methodology I spoke to earlier did not exist prior to about May of last year, so around 18 months. So be careful on the dates you pick when you enter it. Don't try to use some other self-assessment methodology. They specifically call out the one created by DCMA for the DIBCAC assessments. So I think I'm right on time, maybe 1 minute long. Next slide, I think that's it. Okay, so I guess now we just open it up to a Q&A, Tim. Is that how we're going to do it?
Yep. Hey, Wayne, this is Levi over here. So I'll take it over from here and just wanted to take a moment and really say thank you, Wayne, for taking part in this. Thank you, Tim, for setting all this up. I know it's been a long afternoon for me and you sitting here the whole time, and we're really glad everyone was able to take time out of their Friday afternoons and join us. Listen in. So as we've been going through this, there's been a lot of really, really good questions coming through. First one that came in that I really wanted to focus in on, and I know Andy already kind of answered it a little in chat, but I thought it'd be a really good one to talk about. And I know it came up right when Ryan was talking, but is there a CMMC version of the NIST 800-171 Alpha that's going to be released to the Defense Industrial Base?
Well, there's going to be CMMC assessment guides. I would not call it a CMMC version of 171A. I think you're also going to find that, at least initially, the CMMC level 1 through 3 assessment guide is going to look an awful lot like this 800-171A. I mean, it would only make sense to use that as a foundational document, but then you have the additional 20 processes above the 110. But yes, absolutely, they're in draft. They're being reviewed. The DoD will release them. We often get questions to the AB when we're going to release it, and we can't release it because the DoD will. But yes, there will be something similar to 171A that organizations can use to perform your own self-assessment internally prior to a CMMC assessor showing up.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important clarification to make with the assessment guidance, is that the CMMC-AB doesn't have ownership of it. That's something that the Department of Defense itself actually owns, right, Wayne?
Yes, yes,
So,
and nobody thinks it's been released fast enough, but you know, industry's been involved in some of the reviews, and it's just everybody's working so hard in their full-time jobs. People need to realize that, you know, a lot of this stuff that's happening is being done by people who have full-time jobs on top of trying to get this done.
yeah, and Ryan,
Whether it's the AB or industry groups or the DoD or anybody, everybody's pretty task saturated trying to make this happen.
And Ryan, I know that question came up during your segment. Is there anything you want to add to that, or?
I think it's wise to lean on the fact that 800-171A is the federal guidance. So even if that's the minimum and the assessment guide adds more to that, I mean, most organizations haven't even read 171A, if we can be honest. So you might as well start cutting your teeth on that now, because worst case scenario, you're just that much better aligned with the CMMC assessment guide when it comes out.
Yeah, and one comment I make as people I field a lot of questions to the CMMC support at cmmcab.org are, how do I get an assessor? How do I get a consultant? What do I do? This sort of stuff. And I said, well, the first thing I would say is if you're not compliant with 7012 in reality and compliant with 171 right now, then first thing you need to do is get fully compliant with that with no POAMs. And if you want help doing that, take 800-171A and do that. And I think for a vast majority of the cases, that's enough work right there to keep you busy up until the actual guidance and assessors are available and all that follow-on activity. But those are the things you can do right now that will have huge benefit.
100%, Wayne. I know it's something that at least I tell my customers every single day of, CMMC, it's not actually out yet. And in terms of what's in your contracts right now, you're still looking at that DFARS, you're still looking at the NIST 800-171, focus in on that. If you're shooting for level 3, then you're going to have that Delta 20 to work on, but you're going to be in a great spot no matter what.
Well, in this, let's be honest, 7019, 7020 kind of put the big exclamation mark on that advice and drives it home and makes it here, right now.
Exactly. So this next one, and I know it's actually, Wayne, something you talked about a little, and I know Nick talked about it as well, but how do companies know exactly when they're going to have to submit a basic assessment to SPRS?
So the guidance I've been giving for our programs is if you want to do some risk assessment to take a look at what exposure you feel like you're going to have, because as I said, you're only going to get it in new contract activity, whether that's a new contract, a mod, or an extension. They're not going to retroactively inject it into contracts. Take a look at the general amount of contract activity you have in a given month that has the 7012 clause in it. Because as I mentioned before, if you're a company that doesn't do a lot of business with the DoD and you have 2 or 3 relatively long-term stable contracts that you don't expect any sort of mod or extension to, you may never see it for quite some time. If you're in some sort of dynamic environment where they're constantly modding it or putting in additional orders for whatever product you make or anything where they can suddenly inject the clause, you need to get your ducks in order now and get the SPRS scores loaded, because you have to assume starting November 30th, every new contract is going to have it. I don't know that they've been absolutely clear that that's the case, but I think you're better off assuming that and then not seeing it than the flip side. But I'm no contracting expert, and I don't know what the period of time is between, say, the document that mods it or extends it and the actual what they consider contract award, but that would be your window to have to get that score submitted, because the last step, as I understand it, is just prior to contract award, the contracting officer goes to SPRS and verifies that score is there prior to awarding the contract.
That's a great answer. And I'm going to actually toss this next question over to Pat. But is it generally expected that a SIM system will be necessary in order to meet the requirements of CMMC Level 3? If Pat's still there.
I am. I was double muted. When it comes to having a SIM, I mean, just looking at the controls, I mean, with NIST 800-171, it wasn't, I mean, you could meet the controls by collecting logs and having them for the time frame and being able to either manually monitor or just being able to have the policies, have the procedures to be able to meet the requirements. With CMMC, there's some more clarification on being able to centrally collect audit logs. And really, when you look down into the requirements with log reduction, with ease of access, being able to continuously monitor successfully, and being able to be responsive to proactively to things happening in the environment, it's really unavoidable not to have a SIM or similar solution to meet those controls.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pat. And moving into the next question, I'm actually going to toss it back over to Ryan Bonner. But this one gets a little bit specific, and it references one of your slides. But in the dumpster find number 1, where we're looking specifically at 3.4.9 assessment criteria, how, for instance, would we gather evidence for 3.4.9b?
Oh, all right. So just to kind of like put some context back around that, because it was being asked in real time while we had slides up. What we were talking about with that dumpster find was the idea of having the assessment guide act as your shopping list, if you will, for the things that you would use as evidence to show an assessor what you've done on that topic. So some of the things that would have been on that list would have had to do with, potentially policies and procedures that pertain to the use of software in the environment or things like that. I'm sorry, that one was for least function, actually. So the least, or I might be getting my slides mixed up. So if we're using the example, so like of least functionality, which in CMMC is the 062 practice, you have 2 assessment objectives. The first one is really where I would see a lot of your evidence showing up, which is that you define what your essential capabilities for the system are in the first place. And then you circle back around that in objective B, and then basically configure the system to only provide those needed functionalities. So the objective B that I had put forward there was very focused on the technical downstream implementation. But if you look at objective A, you're probably going to be banking all this great material you can show to an assessor, like a definition of what your mission critical capabilities are and necessary functions that you need to have. So that way, when you go to one of these other dumpster finds, like a publicly vetted baseline that's already pre-written for whatever you're setting up, you can ask yourself, does that directly conflict the setting I'm about to turn off or disable, or this functionality I'm about to take away? Does it directly conflict with my definition of an essential need? And if it doesn't, shut it off. So you're probably not going to have an assessor demand that you go through every possible system setting and say, is it turned off or is it turned on? Is it turned off or is it turned on? But if you can show them what went into your process and then what came out of it, which was that these things were deactivated or whatever that may be, that's going to allow an assessor to do a couple of things. First of all, they can meet the assessment objectives. They can show that you defined essential capabilities and that you configured against those. But then also it's going to allow the assessor to leverage more than one of those lists that we showed from 171A. So they might be able to examine some documentation that you have, and then they can go talk to someone who's responsible either for that documentation or the eventual system setup. And then they can get into the weeds on actual system settings and things like that. Something you can click through and show and demonstrate as a mechanism that can be tested. So now they're batting for the cycle there, right? They're looking at documents. That's our examine requirement. They're interviewing someone with a responsibility. That's our interview requirement. And then they are testing or observing a mechanism or process. So if you notice when you go through 800-171A that your shopping list contains something from all 3 lists, then you can feel a lot better about the evidence you've created.
Wow, that's a really good answer. No, I might actually have to think about that one and process that one myself. But just taking it into this next question, and I know we're kind of moving back towards SPRS here a little, but November 30th isn't the official deadline for, getting scores into SPRS, but a lot of the major primes have sent letters asking their subs to have a score uploaded well before that deadline. Any advice on how to navigate that, and that specifically that discrepancy? I'm going to leave that one open for the group.
I've been sitting here, Wayne. I've been sitting here looking at that question on my iPad, and I have to be very careful to navigate this because I'm very good friends with the signatory of the letter. And I meant to actually call him this morning and ask how can I answer this question properly, because I knew it'd come up. To be honest, I hope you understand that the thinking behind it. The thinking behind it is there's a certain amount of a prime supplier base that get it, and I think if you're on this call, you probably get it. And then there's a certain amount that probably couldn't spell CMMC 3 out of 4 times. And if that's a key critical supplier for that large prime, and they don't have a score in SPURS, can't spell SPURS, what's that going to do to the prime's product? Because then they can't let a contract to that company. So the intention is to try and get the attention and get things moving across the entire supply base. My personal opinion would be the best way to handle that is like you would with anything else. Doesn't have to be cyber related. It comes as a directive from your prime, and that's to talk to them, to negotiate it, and work it out. I mean, if that means a call between IT security folks, because we've gotten, even though we're big, we sometimes sub to other peer companies, and we've gotten some often crazy requirements from some of our peers, and there's kind of a secret handshake among the community not to do that to each other. But sometimes it's a matter of IT security professional to IT security professional and talk it out. But at the minimum, your supplier folks who deal with primes on a normal basis for any kind of flow down or request relative to the prime sub relationship should also be talking. So if you're on top of things and you'd rather meet the deadline when it comes via the flow down requirement from the prime, talk to them about it. The bottom line is the prime wants to know that you're aware of it, that you're working towards meeting it, and that your lack of input or response to it's not going to cause problems for the larger product that they're putting together that they depend on you as a sub for, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes a whole lot of sense, especially, like you said, if they're the sole supplier for something that's extremely vital to that upstream prime, that prime's going to want to make sure that their supply chain's doing whatever they can to be prepared for this, that they can continue doing the work that they need them to do for them. So, and
I think we all realistically believe there are some subs out there that this is going to come to a complete shock when they first get the flow down to do this, and they're not going to have a clue what to do. And I think that's what anybody who has subs, you don't have to be a big prime, but any of us on here who sub work out are not going to want to find out that surprise ourselves when it's crunch time.
No, for sure. Yeah, because at the end of the day, you want to be able to keep doing the work that you're doing, and you want to be able to keep utilizing those suppliers of yours that you've been working with, you have a relationship with, and they do good work, and you trust them to do good work. But something like this could definitely put a serious dampen and hamper that relationship between the two parties.
And I'm going to go off on a tangent here a bit, but one of the things I'm hoping CMMC and all this focused attention is going to create with the smaller suppliers is a lot more thoughtful work going into what is exactly flowed down, and if you can avoid flowing down CUI or sensitive data because of the difficulty it's going to cause for the supplier, let's work on creative ways to not flow information down. Maybe that means create a remote environment they come into, and you keep the CUI, and they don't have to then meet the requirements of an L3, or depending on their scenario, what if you send it to them printed and it stays in a safe and it never hits their IT infrastructure? There's a lot of creativity, but that's not going to happen unless you start a relationship talking back and forth between prime and sub, and maybe find different ways to accomplish what you need to with either without passing the CUI or finding some other creative way to get them access to it.
Yeah, 100%. And Wayne, I know it's something we talk about on the Discord and our Thursday night happy hour calls almost on a weekly basis. Kind of moving off of what you were just saying, I wanted to toss it over to Ryan again. And I know, Ryan, this is something you talk about with a lot of your customers, but just understanding where the CUI resides and understanding who in their supply, which one of the, the prime suppliers needs to have access to that CUI, and understanding how to take that data and make it not CUI, because that's doable. If you want to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think that one of the most common problems that we see is, defense contractors waiting for this moment in the future where all of the DoD agencies have perfectly implemented their own CUI programs, and things are being served up to them on a silver platter, expertly marked and completely accurate. And, we may be a ways from that being the norm. So in the meantime, every contractor out there needs to control their own destiny by understanding, first off, what makes something CUI in the first place? And then if we know that, what are the conditions under which it isn't? So, and I'm trying to stay within the guardrails of what we know today, which is that, DFARS 7012 under paragraph M talks about a state of matter, if you will, for the information where the contractor makes the determination on whether it still retains its identity as covered defense information. So if we know that that's a possible outcome, then the question has to come down to what in the definitions of CUI let us make that determination and then propose ways of limiting the data. So this is part of that creative dialogue that Wayne's talking about. This is something that I really think that subcontractors could band together and really control their own fate on this. So when we look at, these are just general concepts, right? But if we look at controlled technical information and know that by its definition, it has a clear military or space application, what is it that makes data not have a military or space application? That might be some top of the mountain, porch sitting to figure that out, but it's something that should be discussed. And then, looking at something like export control, we have these really elaborate but clearly defined BIS decision flows and things like that to understand when something transitions from being specially designed as a defense article into something less than export controlled, or from ITAR down to EAR, or from EAR down to not export controlled at all. So walking through those examples and seeing data transform to meet those definitions is, I think, the bedrock for organizations to be able to take something that was CUI and, using the terminology that the CMMC PMO's office has mentioned in the past, which is disaggregation, or, leaning on some of the other controls in 853 Rev 5, like decontrolling or downgrading. I think we can get there, but it does have to be done as a dialogue, both with primes and agencies.
Yeah, and I know it's something that, oh, sorry, I cut someone off. Wayne, was that you?
Wasn't me.
Okay. All right. Well, I was going to say that I know it's something we talked about extensively last week. We had Leslie on for the BDO Part 4 webinar series, and she talked a lot about understanding CUI and really understanding, what it is and how it could be labeled, and understanding where it is in your environment. And moving off of that into the next question, if a drawing for manufacturing a part is considered CUI, would that finished manufactured part also be considered CUI as well? I'm going to leave that one open to the group.
Well, that's certainly a loaded question, and I'm sure that the immediate answer that jumps to most people's minds is, well, it depends. But if we're thinking specifically about a finished good, where I always start just to see if I can make an immediate determination is form, fit, and function, right? So the definition of a specially designed item under defense articles is that it has to have some sort of unique nature that differentiates it from a standard commercial item or a commodity. It needs to have unique features or shape or gargantuan size or whatever it might be that would take someone to a place where they say, well, that's not clearly a commercial finished good. But then we also need to think about things like what I would call data linkage. So does the fact that that part has a national stock number printed on it make it easily Googleable, if you will, publicly queried, and you can immediately tie it back to a military or space application? Or is there, paperwork going along with it that if that entire shipper or the entire shipment was intercepted, would reveal the nature of those finished goods? So I don't think that the discussion around finished goods ever happens in a vacuum. So I think that's. Go ahead, Wayne.
Or is it protected by adequate anti-tamper technology that would negate any concern about it being CUI or some sort of requiring some sort of protection? So that just leads to the same concept of it depends.
Yeah, I think that everyone in the defense industrial base is looking for global answers, sort of these tectonic yes/no determinations. And really, I think the thing I would encourage to DIB contractors is this is a situation where you do have to distill down, like, what is the nature of the data that I handle, the finished goods that I create, the services that I deliver or provide. What is it about them that differs from my commercial work? And really get down into some of those subatomic discussions. You only have to go there a few times to kind of develop the rule set that you're gonna build for your entire organization. But once you get there, you get to have a much more informed conversation with the rest of your supply chain, including your customers. You actually, could be in a position to float an argument that says, hey, because of this reason and this reason and this reason that I think we're in agreement on, if I do X, Y, and Z to these data sets, these aren't going to be CUI anymore because of these reasons. You really do need to order it out and explain your logic. There's not going to be just the global flip of a switch where CUI is no longer a part of your concern. It's a new operational excellence that needs to be developed in the same way as cybersecurity. But I would go so far as to say that the more you develop that skill set, that operational excellence of data, understandings of data stewardship, knowing what makes something CUI and not, chances are you're relieving the burden for the IT nerds on the cybersecurity side who may now not need to implement CMMC requirements in as broad of a scope.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot to unpack with that question. And Wayne, Ryan, I think that's a great job. With that, I know coming up on time. I'm going to hand it back over to Andy and Tim to close us out.
Awesome. Thank you, Levi. Everybody, Andy Sauer checking back in, try to close this all, tie it all together in a neat knot for you, and go about your read-only Friday. So first off, if you attended all of the sessions today, my hat is off to you. It is a lot of information from a lot of really great companies and really good people, but that doesn't change the fact that it's a lot of information. So thanks for sticking it out. It's been a little over 4 hours. So yeah, good job. Ryan Heidorn, who I know had to drop off here, left a really great quote when he was talking about MSP partners. And he said that CMMC is not a project. And that's, I think, a message that I've been trying to convey in different ways of stating it, but he stated it so simply and it says so much. It's going to have upfront costs in terms of labor and finances, kind of like a project, but these are capabilities that need to achieve longevity in organizations. It's really, CMMC is a challenge to add a business capability, not just a short-term project. So I think it's very important that we, as industry people, as I look at the names of the people who are attending today, I see a lot of industry names, a lot of folks who are out there responsible for getting this message delivered. I think it's very important that we get the communication on this correct. And we are saying this is not a short-term project. This is not a checklist. This is a change. This is a journey. Secondly, I heard from someone after my initial session that I painted quite a message of doom and gloom about CMMC in my early talk. I set the stage a bit grim. We spent time comparing CMMC to the 5 stages of grief. A little more tongue-in-cheek intended, so you can blame the speaker there. but certainly paint it in a little bit of a negative light. What I want to close it out with is just kind of switch that around a little bit and make sure everyone understands it's really not all that bad. If CMMC was this terrible doom and gloom scenario, I don't think we'd all be on this call. Throughout this Ensemble series, if you've come to all 5 of these events, you've heard from 20 different people, from 20 different companies. It's been a real mishmash of people from companies as big as Microsoft, who we've all obviously heard of, and companies as small as Sentinel Blue, which literally no one has heard of. And I can make that joke because it's my company. But the reason I bring that up and the reason I talk about all these people is that this has been a community effort. And this is a community specifically that sees CMMC as an opportunity to get better as an industry. Most everyone that you've heard from is just trying to play their role in helping industry get better, right? So we all generally believe there's opportunity here to do better. At a personal level, I'm just going to pull the curtain back a little bit in my own motivations and how I do my professional practice and tell you what what I'm really trying to do in my work and around CMMC. I feel like it's basically it's a Trojan horse, and it's breached the boardroom in a way that I haven't heard of that happening before. Admittedly, my career in the defense space has been fairly short. I haven't been in like Mr. Wayne Boline, who's been around I think since they formed the Department of Defense. But this has some hold finally where I don't think we've had that before. In my own personal experience, I had an occurrence with the chairman of a board of a decent sized company, retired 4-star general type, who stated that he was giving his team carte blanche to get this done, to get CMMC in place, to make the organizational level changes that needed to happen. That to me is big, and that presents a big opportunity. These are essentially green pastures. These are, this is an opportunity to right your organization's ship by way of CMMC. Anyone who knows me and is a member of the community knows I'll be among the first to criticize certain elements of CMMC. It definitely has some things it needs to do better, some things that I'm not a big fan of. But overall, the effect here is a huge opportunity, and it's a fairly tremendous step in the right direction. Really, what it's implementing, what's encouraging us to do is implement good cybersecurity. And to me, good cybersecurity is liberating. Another discussion I had in my personal experience just yesterday was with a business executive who is concerned that when his sales staff leave his company, they're taking all the materials, all the proposals, all their marketing, pamphlets and that kind of stuff with them when they quit. They have no control over their data. They don't have any visibility. And I told him, you should just assume that's all been taken, because that probably is the case. That's a big burden on a business. That's holding a business back. That's bad cybersecurity that is holding a business back. Good cybersecurity and a good cybersecurity capability and mindset to your organization will protect and sort of act as a force multiplier in what you're able to do. It's not easy. It costs resources. For a lot of companies, they've ignored cybersecurity. It's been this thing that the IT folks in the closet do. But if you adopt it, it's an investment in the longevity and the effectiveness of your business. Half of the things that cybersecurity is demanding, half of really what CMMC is demanding, is to introduce good engineering principles, introduce things that improve efficiency and effectiveness of your business processes anyway. So by adopting cybersecurity and making this pivot, we're not making anything worse. We have an opportunity to make things better. Like I would throw down the gauntlet. I would challenge you. Show me a business who has a mature cybersecurity capability that is currently being outclassed by a competitor, a peer who doesn't have a mature cybersecurity capability. I don't think I've ever heard of one or seen one in my personal practice where that was the case. The companies who have mature cybersecurity capabilities are mature in their business processes, in their overall business capability. So just want to tie it all together. Want to make sure everyone understands and recognizes that CMMC is an opportunity as an industry. It's breached into the boardroom. It's got their attention. It's got industry talking for the first time in this industry since I've been around it. It seems like there's some real momentum to actually getting cybersecurity a seat at the table, and that's what this really is all about. And CMMC, it's a challenge. We understand it's a challenge. My point here is I encourage you all to accept that challenge and work on getting your organizations, your clients to join you in accepting that challenge. So with that, just thanks again to BDO and Mr. Tim Trickett, to all the panelists and all the companies that pulled all this together. It's been really cool to watch over the last month. It's been a community effort. I encourage everyone listening, join in the community. We've got a couple specific ones that a lot of us are members of. We've referenced the Discord, we've referenced Reddit, but there's great communities on LinkedIn. There's industry communities. Get involved, engage with that community, share your expertise, share your experience, and ask questions. We're all in it together. There's always help. You need only ask. So thanks again, everybody. Toss over to Tim Trickett.
All right, that's it. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you to all the presenters, all the companies, everyone that put an effort to make all this stuff happen all month long. And that is it. One last thing. So I do have this contact information slide. We'll be posting this video on YouTube for people to go back and watch, and then also be sending out the slide deck. This is everyone's email from today and LinkedIn, so anyone that's attending will have that. Thank you.